My guest today is Daniel Hoyer. He's the project manager and senior research fellow at Seshat and co-editor of the book that we'll be discussing today, Figuring Out the Past. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I had not heard about this project, Seshat, until recently, but researching it because of reading your book, it's such a good idea. But I have a feeling that my listeners are probably not familiar with it. So do you want to give us a rundown of what Seshat is?
Sure. And I wasn't familiar with it when I started working there either. Really, it started in 2011, and it was just the brainchild of Peter Turchin and Harvey Whitehouse and a few other people. Really, they just got together and tried to bring what we call a sort of more natural science approach. So, theory testing and statistics and sort of data analysis type methods, but to the study of the human past. Um, and this sort of project grew. It has huge ambitions, trying to cover as much about the human past from every corner of the globe as we possibly can. I came on board in 2014, and I was actually hired as a 1.5 year postdoc after finishing my degree in classics. And I just sort of never left, and now they can't get rid of me. Um, and it's really an interesting project, and what sort of drew me to it was really deliberately trying to bring together as much knowledge that is held in every sort of individual's head as possible. And so this is historians who have expert knowledge in their own region or in their own time period that they're interested in. This is social scientists, political scientists, evolutionary biologists, statisticians, really everybody who's sort of interested in topics concerning our shared collective past, bringing this all together, trying to answer some kind of big questions that we may have in a collaborative way.
Let's go over your background a little bit. So
Mhm.
before you came to Seshat, what were you up to and how did this end up being something that fit into your career? Because it's such a singular project for a historian.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of an odd path, and there were those who advised me not to get involved with it from the historical world. So my background, I'm actually a classics major. My PhD is in classics. Graduated in 2014, as I recall, from NYU. And again, I had a fairly traditional historical upbringing. Like classics is a fairly traditional, often conservative sort of field, sort of methodologically conservative. And so, I was raised with this type of normal, diving deeply into one particular aspect of, say, the Roman Empire, which is what my focus was. A lot of my dissertation work was around trying to explore the kind of well-being or what exactly made the high Roman Empire so successful. Like, why did it work so well? Why was it so big? Why was it able to do the things that it was? And again, I'm doing traditional sorts of things. I'm looking at documentary sources. I'm looking at archaeological material, looking at inscriptions and coins and things. And I started to sort of ask myself these kind of questions about, oh, well, what actually is it that is driving the success of the Roman Empire? And so I looked at economic growth. I looked at some of their political and legal frameworks. I looked at some of the cultural modes. And a lot of things kind of started to make sense to me, but I wasn't sure if I was on the right path. And then this kind of led me into naturally asking comparative questions. I say, oh, have there been other societies that have had this kind of, let's say, um, urban culture that led to this sort of urban development that seemed to be a key to the Roman success? And so I looked at, examples of China, and they have a very different urban history, yet a very successful empire. And that just helped me put some things into perspective, taking this kind of comparative frame. And when I was finishing up, there was just this sort of advertisement. I had met Peter Turchin at a seminar. I think I was auditing a seminar at Columbia, and he came to give a guest talk, and he was just fantastic. Then, a few years later, as I'm finishing up, he's advertising for this postdoc position. I said, "Oh, that sounds really interesting." My advisor sort of encouraged me to take it. Many people in my department, sort of other people I looked to for advice, who were these traditional historians, said, "No, you can't do this. That's crazy. What do you mean? They're bringing stats and treating history as data. That doesn't make any sense. What are you doing? What are you going to do?" But just again, taking this very holistic, very comparative kind of framework really appealed to me, and that's sort of where I got involved.
This show typically is about the history of places. And one of the things that I really liked about your book is when I go to ancient Rome, like Roman sites, or when I go to ancient Greek sites, and I'm like thinking about the history, I'm thinking about that specific history, not usually how the histories of the world are intertwined, and also just comparatively, like when you're in a place, you tend to be focused on that place. What are some of the things that struck you as interesting from how societies are similar across the globe?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, and that again was my framework too. I was, as a classicist, very focused on what made Rome unique and what are these traits that make unique. And obviously, there's a ton of things that make it unique. But what continues to strike me is actually how many similarities there are, no matter where you're looking, no matter what time frame you're looking at. There's just a lot of common aspects, and I think things like just the way that people band together in groups and how they collaborate, how they cooperate with each other, you know, congregate in these cities, how they build shared spaces. And I think actually a lot of the monuments that you see, and obviously this is something that you would focus on, when you travel to these places, you still see these monuments, you see these buildings and statues and these public squares in all these areas. And it always strikes me how kind of similar they are, no matter where you go. Having an area for the exchange of ideas and the exchange of goods, having buildings that are bringing people together, that are sources of sites of political decisions being made, having these great sort of achievements, these great monuments that glorify our ideas, our sort of collective achievements, these sorts of commonalities. But then also sort of the flip side and kind of the dark side of this is something that recurs, is just how violent and terrible we can be to each other, and really how sort of all these societies are struggling between the sort of selfish and greedy desires that we have to sort of capture as much as we can for ourselves and sort of dominate others, and being at the top of these hierarchies, and how that kind of contrasts with these really imperatives to work together and to be collaborative. And you see that all over the place. There's a ton of examples like that, and that's sort of what drives me into work like figuring out the past, is really setting out what are our glorious achievements and what are some of our darker stories that we all kind of share in common in our past.
What are some of the more interesting findings or that stuck out to you, maybe about places you hadn't really thought about
Mhm.
much before?
Yeah, I mean, working on this, and also, I think it was last year I co-edited a volume with my colleague Jenny Reddish on the Axial Age. And one of the things that sort of struck me in both of these works and sort of throughout my recent research is, again, this sort of conflicting, what I would call conflicting dynamics between sort of the best and the worst of our nature. And I was actually thinking really recently about the Mekong Delta and sort of what's today Cambodia, um, sort of high Middle Ages, the Angkor Kingdom, great, amazing kingdom. Thinking about actually Angkor Wat, right, one of the great wonders of the world, one of the largest monuments ever built in the medieval period. And it was built and dedicated by the sort of Angkor Emperor Suryavarman II in the mid 12th century, I believe. Um, and again, it's this amazing monument. It's dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu. It's really all about, again, the collaborative achievement of this kingdom. It's about sort of honoring their sort of belief in Hindu ideals and taking care of each other. And Suryavarman was one of these great pro-social rulers. Like, he did a ton of things. He had all this irrigation work that the state invested in to make people's lives better, to help sort of farming communities. He built a ton of hospitals. There was this whole really complex network of sort of famine relief centers and hospitals to care for the sick, old age centers, really a lot of great public works that this one king in particular did. Again, all in sort of the interest of honoring his Hindu ideals, really. But at the same time, one of the things that strikes me when you actually look into the kingdom is that these sorts of ideals and these sorts of um, you know public goods and public protections lived very comfortably beside this very strong hereditary elite. Um, they practiced slavery. They were very comfortable with slavery. There's some indications that they practiced human sacrifice, and some of their sort of monuments were inaugurated with the slaughter of a few people. And again, it's that balance that when I see these sort of great monuments and I think about the achievements that they represent, I'm always kind of struck by the sort of violence that is also uh, in their shadow, if you will.
So obviously, this hasn't been a year where you've probably traveled that much, if at all. But what has working on history at this kind of like holistic data perspective? How has it changed how you like physically experience places when you do see them, even if they're just like local places?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So when I was a graduate student, I traveled a little bit. I went to Europe a lot. I was actually supposed to go to North Africa at one time, but was prevented from it because of the Arab Spring. So my travel has been thwarted in many places. Spent some time in Egypt, which was really interesting as a graduate student. But again, I was always focused on my particular interest. Why when I was in Egypt, I was focused on the Roman period and maybe the Greek period. Um, but sort of, I feel looking back now, I kind of overlooked the longer timescales. I overlooked the early dynastic period. I kind of didn't really care or know much about the Islamic period. Um, and so now, when I go to places, when I've been to Japan recently and been to Istanbul a couple of years ago, it makes me appreciate the greater sweep of things, if you will. And so even when I see monuments, going to Kyoto and seeing some of the fantastic Buddhist temples in Kyoto, I'm not just thinking about the Buddhist temples, I'm thinking about sort of the whole process of Shinto Buddhism and sort of how Buddhism developed in Japan in this really complicated, long, drawn out way, how it's different there than it is in um, Thailand or Vietnam or Cambodia. And again, just really helps put into perspective what makes each place sort of unique and what makes each place stand out.
Is there anything before we move on to talk about some of the different aspects of this particular type of research?
Mhm.
Is there any other thing that you found in your research that was amusing or was particularly stuck with you?
I mean, one of the things that sort of particularly stuck with me, and I don't even know why, but the sort of West African community of Gene, which was this sort of city state in the first mid first millennium CE. It's one of these sort of outlier communities, and it's hard to explain it. But it was this really sophisticated kind of manufacturing, proto manufacturing hub. There were these. They had the center of this trade routes. They were making a lot of great sort of ceramic goods and a lot of metallic goods that they were trading around throughout sub-Saharan Africa. It was just really thriving, amazing, complicated, sophisticated place. And one of the things that sort of strikes people that I only found out I think last year speaking to some archaeologists from the region is they have absolutely no evidence of ruling elites. And this kind of goes contrary to what I started out with saying, oh, we all have, all these places have these commonalities and you see the same patterns repeating. But West Africa is one of these places where you actually don't see this pattern repeating. And that just keeps standing out to me that you have these, large population growth, you have all this wealth, and any other part of the world where we've seen this, you see this translate into strict social hierarchies. You see rulers, you see palaces. Um, think of the great castles of medieval France, or think of, the great sort of palaces in dynastic China. You don't see anything like that. There's really no differentiation in the archaeology or the material culture. And it looks like it was really essentially this hierarchical society where you had family units, you had these kind of manufacturing industry rulers were just getting together and solving problems collectively. It was this kind of great proto democracy that nobody ever talks about. And again, that's one of the side benefits of taking this comparative look is it also highlights these sort of outliers, these really unique, strange, amazing places like Gene.
So obviously, as somebody who is just published a book about this database, the database is something that you believe in. But what would you say, are the limitations of this kind of research that somebody would want to keep in mind?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question. It's something we talk about sort of amongst ourselves a lot. Um, I wouldn't necessarily call it a limitation. I think it's important to be clear about what sort of question you're interested in at any one time. And, what we tend to do, what my research tends to do right now, because it's comparative, it's really macro focused. It's looking for these large scale patterns, it's looking for divergences from these patterns. It's really trying to answer sort of great large questions on the kind of global scale. And what most sort of historians do, and what I often do, and with my historian hat on, is look for the details, and it's looking at much narrower time scales, much more focused sort of regional histories, and look at, okay, what was this battle all about, or what was this leader doing, or what exactly was going on in the early Republican Rome, for example, or something like that. And so, the sort of Seshat, or the cryodynamic perspective, that is this sort of macroscope, is really not appropriate for answering or asking questions about particulars, about these particular regions or these particular moments or events in history. But at the same time, there's a necessary link between them. We can't do what we do. We can't compare things or find these large scale trends without delving into the nuance, without delving into the sort of key specifics about each region. And so this is why we collaborate with historians. We different methods are suitable for different questions, but you can manipulate or maneuver the method depending on what you actually want to do. So really, one of the things that appeals to me about this is there's not really any limitations, because there's so much flexibility in how you can draw material together and reach these sorts of conclusions depending on the scale you're looking at.
So it seems like the data bank is in part designed to, or not designed to, but it's a completely different approach to history than
Mhm.
the great man theory of history, which obviously has been critiqued a million times, but still is what people gravitate to when they're talking about, you know, a television show that inspires people to like history, or, and like it might not be appropriate for a history class, but it is what gets people into a palace or into a particular building. Like we still like tie our experiences to those narratives, even if like we understand rationally that that's not really how the world works, and these are not really the most important things to know about the world. However, it sounds like at some level you have to put personality or particulars back into and create some kind of narrative. You can't just evaluate history based just on
Well, I don't know if I'd say that. We would argue that
numbers.
you can. I mean, it depends on again the specific question, but you can actually get pretty far of the way with just the numbers. And one of the things that again stands out is these, as you say, these stories about the great men or these great leaders are super interesting, but it's really hard to explain what's actually going on, especially when you take the sort of larger look with just sort of the personality, because you see the same things have very different effects, sort of depending on these broader trends or these underlying contexts. I mean, this is something we're actually working on a lot recently, and it has a lot to say about our sort of current moments. And we see, for example, a lot of rulers in the past. Even thinking about the Arab Spring movements. You see a man like Mohammed Bouazizi lighting himself on fire, and this is the sort of moment. This is a emotive story. This is an emotive image, and this is the event that launches the Arab Spring in Tunisia. He's sort of protesting maltreatment. But of course, he's not the first or last person to light themselves on fire in protest. And in most cases, sort of a self immolation act like that doesn't, in fact, result in a massive regional sweep of revolutions. And so, what we want to do, and sort of what our perspective would say, is that the act of these individuals, these sort of great figures, can only ever be a small part of the story. And in fact, you can understand a lot about what's going on by looking at the longer term trends in Tunisia or Egypt or Libya, comparing that to, even in the US in the 60s, there was a series of self immolations in response to the involvement in the Vietnam War. Didn't spark a series of revolutions because it's a very different underlying context. And those you can figure out with the numbers. So I guess that's my response to that.
Do you think there's any predictive value
Mm.
from these type of numbers if, on like a policy level?
Yeah, and this this is also something I've been thinking a lot about personally. Again, I think it's important not to go overboard and not to sort of overstress how predictive they are, or we're not trying to come up with the policy that's going to solve the world's problems. But on the other hand, because you do see, as they say, things happen a lot again and again. These sort of patterns do seem to repeat themselves. And so I do think that there is, not quite prediction, but maybe kind of forecasting. Like we can say that, um, you can see the pressures build up. And this is work that we've done. You can track, you can essentially retrodict these great historical events by tracking these long-term trends. If you look at, rising inequality, for example, mixed with sort of polarization among the political and economic elites, you can use that to sort of say, okay, well, I expect then that there's going to be a period of crisis in, Rome in the first century BCE. And lo and behold, you see this great sweep of crisis, and you can, predict that you would expect there to be a major violent revolution in the US in the 19th century. And of course, we see that. And so we are able, because of our sort of large comparative look, to really pull out these kinds of patterns. And somewhat surprisingly, these patterns still hold in the modern world, and we can, and in fact, Peter has used this sort of knowledge to forecast some of the things that are going on now. Work he did 10 years ago suggested that 2020 was going to be a kind of tumultuous and terrible year, and of course, unfortunately, that was accurate.
Ah.
Yeah, I know.
Well, this is coming out right as 2020 is wrapping. So what does he predict for 2021?
Unfortunately, it doesn't look great.
Oh gosh.
We have a couple more years of this. I mean, the you know the reason that we don't like calling this prediction is because just being aware of it should be enough to change the course of it. And so, we're not predicting that there's going to be more, civil violence and unrest for the next 5 years. It's likely to happen unless, again, some of the key preconditions are changed. And there's actually pretty good signs. In my country, in Canada, in the US, there are some good signs that these preconditions are, in fact, being mitigated. So this is things like inequality. This is things like the polarization in sort of political parties, the kind of vitriol that people are talking to each other with. There are signs that these can be sort of lessened and mitigated. And if they are, then the prospects of sort of more peaceable, inclusive, kind of democratic functioning are much, much, much higher in the next couple of years.
So not to be too nihilistic, but does it feel, it sounds like you're hopeful, but does it feel at times like you're screaming into a void when the system is so unresponsive to things you guys just intuitively know would get us off of the, like, get us back on the right track, get the train, like keep the train from going over the cliff?
The short answer is yes, it does often feel very frustrating to be shouting at that. And I think, unfortunately, one of the patterns that we see again is that, it's really hard because it requires this sort of change, seems to require a lot of buy-in by those who are actually benefiting from the system. And it's really hard to get people who are benefiting from a system to change that system. But there are examples of this. And, again, I think of, even in the case of Rome, you think of the early Republic, the conflict of the orders is this amazing instance where, have this hugely hierarchical, unequal society where you have these sort of inherited nobility, essentially these aristocrats who control all economic and military and political power. And they end up fighting this war against, these other Italian communities, the Sabines and others. This is the early 5th century. And these wars are really just for their own, expansion of their own economic interests. But of course, it's the regular farmers who are being asked to be soldiers who are dying and facing all these peril. And the soldiers stand up and say, wait a minute, this doesn't benefit us at all. Why are we doing this? This is ridiculous. And they stage a strike, like a literal soldier strike. They just refuse to march out to battle and fight. And so all these aristocrats who have committed to this war say, "Oh crap, what are we going to do?" Um, and they basically get together and negotiate a bunch of concessions and a lot of what in popular imagination is understood as being the hallmarks of the Roman Republican system. The American Republican representative democracy is based on these initial principles of having representation, having every class, every sort of region has their body of representation, coming together in councils to vote on electives to make sure that everyone's interests are being looked after. Well, these were actually only put in place because of this soldier strike in the 5th century. And this is where these get set up in the Roman case. And again, this is, we see things like this happen throughout history. Like this happens all the time in Persia. This happens in Egypt basically every couple hundred years. This happens in China every couple hundred years, where you have, sort of soldiers or the general population is being asked to give more and more, and eventually they get sick of it and they revolt. And in 95% of these cases, this results in some very violent, very destructive civil war, essentially, or some sort of rebellion. But this is what gives me hope, is that there are still those 5% of cases, like this early Roman Republican instance, this conflict of the orders in the 5th century BCE, where they said, okay, instead of actually going to battle with our soldiers, instead of leading to this rebellion, let's put in some reforms. Let's make some changes. What's going to make us happy? What's going to reestablish our cooperative lens? And so, there's sort of just enough positive examples sprinkled throughout the record that I do have some optimism.
So let's talk a little bit about the book, because it's an interesting project, and it seems like, um, I'm so, just to put a pin in that, just because I guess I'm not in a place where emotionally I'm ready to be hopeful. So I'm very reassured that you are, because
Mhm.
you know more than me about what there is to be hopeful and not hopeful about.
Mhm. Well, I'm glad I can give some hope here.
I have another podcast that I run with, actually a Canadian travel writer, and it, it's called the Rick Steves Over Brunch podcast. And
Mhm.
normally we just review episodes of Rick Steves' travel show, and it's super fun and light. But this year it's been so dark. And then we reviewed like an episode on fascism, like right before the election, and it was just,
Yeah.
it's been a really hard year too. Like when you're in travel professionally, and and you focus on like historic travel, and there's a travel ban and everybody seems to be reverting back to 1935, it can be a little bit overwhelming.
Yep. Yep. I hear that.
So so the book is called Figuring Out the Past, but let me pull up the official title, because
Mhm.
all good academic books, it's got a very nice title, a
Mhm.
long title. All right. Figuring Out the Past, the 3,495 vital statistics that explain world history.
Mhm.
And this, you are a co-editor with Peter Turchin. And how did the book come about? And I know we've talked on it in abstract, but what are some of the specific statistics that you think are some of the most interesting in the book?
Yeah, the sort of story of it is it's due mostly to Ed Lake, who's works with the publisher Profile Books, and he's just someone who had we had published with before, and we just knew him. We were at some workshop in Oxford. I think this was 3 years ago or so, and Peter and I and Ed Lake were sort of just talking about some of the work that we're doing with Seshat, especially around looking at kind of social complexity and how does social complexity rise and fall throughout the world. And we're just basically talking, giving different stories about how we're collecting data on, the territory of different states. We have like 500 different historical polities at that point that we're looking at, population, things about the way that the bureaucracy works and whether they use coinage or not, and what kind of written material, written records do they have, and just all these different aspects of all these different societies. And we're just sort of spouting out these things and looking up, references in the data bank, sort of as we're sitting there in a bar over drinks. And Ed goes, this is really interesting. Like people would want to know some of this stuff. And Peter and I, as academics, we all often get sort of lost in our own questions and our own analysis. We're like, oh, really, people, this is interesting to people, not just us. And so, I mean, it never occurred to us that, we had been spending years collecting all this data, and that people might actually want to know some of this. And we're like, oh, that, great, that's so cool, that's excellent. And Ed is the one who, because Profile publishes the Economist's Pocket, what is it, Pocket World and Figures volumes, which is, a sort of yearly snapshot of all these statistics that, in their words, explain how the world works. And so his pitch was, well, why don't you kind of do that, but for the past? And we said, okay, that sounds pretty good. That's a sort of format we can step into. And that's really how the book came to be, and sort of why it is arranged the way it is, in these sort of, statistical snapshots and these kind of figures that explain the world. That's where it came from.
So outside of academia, where I can understand why people would want to pick this volume up, who is kind of your ideal reader that would peruse all of this data in that is surprising, and I mean, it really is, it's a book of data. So what, in your head when you were working on it, who did you want to enjoy this book?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. Sort of everyone. I mean, really anybody who is generally interested in the past and knows a little bit about the past, or knows, about a handful of different societies. But this, one of the main goals that I have, and one of the things I'm sort of most proud of, is that we're able to put a lot of facts and just highlight some cultures that you probably haven't heard of. Like the Dayak culture of Borneo. I had never heard of them before a couple of years ago when I started working with some anthropologists. Amazing community, these sort of small scale bands, sort of 500 people communities living in these longhouses in Western Borneo. Again, this really sort of egalitarian family council kind of community, but at the same time, there's this amazingly complex kind of expansionist regime. I had never heard about them, but you can see a lot of similarities with processes that unfold in other parts of the world. When you look at, what are they doing? How are they organizing themselves? Again, these sorts of stats that are in the book, bringing this all together and giving it perspective.
Where can people pick up a copy?
People can pick up a copy, I'm told, anywhere. It's definitely on Amazon.
Okay.
You can find it through the Profile Books publishers in the UK. In the US, it's published by Hachette Publishing House, and their website has it. It's on Abe Books, it's on Goodreads, it's sort of wherever you get your fine reading material.
If you are stuck in your house and you want to have some interesting holiday discussions, I suggest picking this up, because there are just it's the experience of going through it was so different from a typical history book, and I feel like it's almost would make like a good coffee table volume where you can just pick it up, look at it, think about what you saw, and then open it to a different page later.
Yeah. And honestly, even just for myself, I'm really glad it's actually in print now, because I have a copy and I refer to it every day when I'm trying to remember something.
So if it's a win just for that alone, that's amazing. All right. Well, Dan, thank you so much for coming on the show. This is such a different look at history for the show, but I feel like I'm going to keep this conversation with me when I am allowed to travel again. And so I just appreciate that so much. And thank you so much for coming on.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I look forward to hearing your shows when you're actually allowed to go travel again.
Yes.